Alright, recording everything you say.
Okay.
Everything you say will be held against you.
Alright. I guess we're just about ready to get started. Don't feel any rush. We got food set up over there and everything. Do you have anything else you need to say? Okay. Okay. Yeah, so if you need to go back and get seconds or whatever, don't worry. That's kind of just have a relaxed atmosphere and everything, so that'll be good. I'm really excited to be here. I want to throw a couple things out as we get started. The first thing is I have a little bit of some kind of sinus, something that went into my ear, so I don't quite know how loud I'm talking, and I can't quite hear as well as I would like to. So if you have a comment and I don't quite get it, don't be offended that I have to ask you twice to hear it, or if I'm talking too loud, someone just say, please shut up a little bit, and let's go from there. So that being said, the other thing that I want to throw out as we get started, we're talking about the end of time. I in no way can claim, and I don't think any of us can claim, honestly, but certainly as the one standing up here, I cannot claim to be an expert on what we're going to be talking about. I can claim to be doing the best that I can to talk about what Scripture says and to go into some details, hopefully maybe some things we haven't thought of to help us understand. But there are a lot of things that are confusing, and in an hour or so for 4 nights in the month, we're only going to be able to scratch the surface. However, I do hope we can at least do justice to some of the main texts that do discuss these topics. And as we go through this process, please, please, please ask questions, bring up thoughts, bring up concerns or confusions with what we're talking about, because part of the reason why the class is designed in this way, and why Garrett and I just kind of figured out to do it in this format, is because usually the best kind of learning is going to come with interaction. So I'm going to ask some questions. I hope you will ask questions of me, and we'll go from there. So we're going to start tonight, as we're talking about the end of time, talking about the end of time according to Jesus. Again, we have a lot that we need to go through, but I hope that we can at least give a good summary to kind of bring it all together as we move through. The first thing I want to throw out there, how many times does Jesus actually talk about the end of time? Anybody know? Of course, we have some copies of the same thing Jesus says in multiple Gospels, but anybody want to guess how many times Jesus talks about the end of time, the end of the world, that kind of thing?
8.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
Once.
Okay. 8 and once are both pretty close. We could kind of, it depends on how we want to define it, right? For example, parable of the sheep and the goats. Okay, well, we're talking about judgment, the end of time there, so maybe we could throw that in there. There's a couple other things like the gathering of the fish, the parable of the dragnet. He gathers the fish and separates them out. Maybe that's talking about judgment, the end of time. But in terms of really talking in any kind of detail, I would say maybe once, spread out, of course, across multiple different Gospels, but they record the same instance. And beyond that, we don't have much that Jesus himself recorded for us says about the end of time. However, this one time has caused a lot of discussion, it has caused a lot of debate, and so I hope that it will be helpful for us in particular to focus on this one passage as we begin our series looking at this. So if you would be turning to that passage, we're going to look at the account in Matthew 24. There are other accounts in Mark and Luke, and we'll have a lot of the text on the screen as well, but there's some of it we'll just read together because it is a long chapter. But Matthew, I believe, has, I guess maybe we could say, the most complete record of that conversation that Jesus has with his disciples. And so even though Mark and Luke have some things to say that are recording the same conversation, they don't quite give us as much, so we're going to just stick with Matthew's just for the sake of ease. So I want us, before we really get into some of the details, I want us to go ahead and just look a little bit at how this chapter begins, how it kind of sets the scene for all the things Jesus is about to put on us, okay? So let's start with how the chapter begins in verse 1. Jesus left the temple and was going away, and his disciples came to him to point out the buildings of the temple. Now, it's interesting, if you back up to chapter 23, Jesus has just talked about how the temple, how Jerusalem, how all these things, they don't remind him of how good Israel is. That's how most of the Jews in Jesus' day saw the temple in Jerusalem. They looked at it and said, wow, look at what God has done for us. Look at who we are. Look at how amazingly we've been blessed. And Jesus says, no, when I see the temple, when I see the city, it reminds me of how often my people have abandoned me and rejected me. And so right on the heels of that, the disciples, being kind of bad at reading the room like they often were, they say, wow, look at all these things. You know, they're mostly from Galilee. They're not used to seeing the big city, right? And so, Jesus, look at these amazing feats of architecture. Look at the temple. Look at all these things. And notice how Jesus responds. He answered them, you see all these things, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. Way to rain on the parade, right? These things are amazing. Yeah, it's all going to come crashing down. Okay, well, now we're kind of changing the conversation. Jesus was known for that. Something is going to happen that's catastrophic to the temple and the buildings in Jerusalem. Now, in order for us to understand the weight of that, we have to remember how the Jews think about the temple. What is the temple in the mind of the Jew in the first century, or really at any point since the temple has been built? What does the temple represent for Jews? Do what?
God's house.
God's house, good. What does that mean?
Holy.
God dwells there. You go there, God is there.
Okay, God dwells there. God is there. That's where God's presence is. That's where God's glory is. If you think about from the beginning when you have Moses bringing out the law and constructing the tabernacle, remember what happens when the tabernacle is dedicated, if we want to describe it like that? The glory of God fills the temple in the form of a cloud, and they're not even able to go into the temple because of that glory. And he's saying, well, that's all going to be destroyed. Now, this has happened before for the Jews, hasn't it? Back in the 500s BC, the Babylonians come in and they just wipe out Jerusalem, and that includes the temple. They destroy the temple. Solomon's temple, that was an amazing, not only monument to the service of God of Israel to God, but also just a monument of engineering and so forth. Well, it was destroyed. Eventually, it was rebuilt, not super great, but then Herod, in an attempt to get the Jews to like him, really, he built this second temple, Herod's temple, which is the one that they're describing here, and it, once again, was pretty impressive. And the thought was, okay, now we have a temple worth being proud of. This is how the Jews were thinking. Now we're ready for what we expect to be coming, and we're going to get to that in just a second. So he says, this is all going to be thrown down. There's not going to be a stone left on another stone. And as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things be, and when will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Okay. Whenever we think about this question, there's something that we have to understand. They just asked three separate things. When will these things be, referring to what he just said, the temple and these buildings are going to be torn down, and when will be the sign of your coming, and will be the end of the age? I'm not saying those three things don't happen at the same time. I'm also not saying they do, and we'll talk about that in a second. But in their minds, we have to be thinking in terms of how they're asking the question, and therefore how Jesus answers it. We have to recognize, in their minds, all of this is going to go together. They're expecting everything as far as the coming of the new age, the coming of the Messiah, the coming of the Messiah's kingdom. All of this they're expecting to happen all at once. And the reason why, and this is key throughout this whole chapter that we're looking at tonight, is because of Daniel. Notice, this is a messianic prophecy in Daniel. The people of the prince, I would argue, and there's debate about this, but I would argue this is a reference to Jesus. The people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war and desolations are decreed. If you continue reading in Daniel chapter 9, This is, even in Jesus' day, by many understood to be prophetic about the time of the Messiah. And so the disciples have these kinds of prophecies, these kinds of expectations going around their mind, and they don't understand exactly what all is being talked about here. And so they want some clarification on it, but they think they understand at least a little. Now, anybody know who that is? If you do, I'm going to just hand you $5 out of my pocket because I would be super impressed. I had no idea when I just looked at the picture.
Alexander.
Do what?
Alexander.
Okay. This is actually not too far from Alexander the Great, but no. This is a man called Judas. But it's not Judas, the one who betrays Jesus. This is a different Judas. His name is Judas Maccabeus. This is a man who, by many, even who have no dog in the fight, if you will, when it comes to the Jews being successful in world history, even by many just secular historians, is considered to be one of the greatest generals of all time. Just quick backstory on this guy. You have during the 200s, or really the 100s, the 2nd century, before Christ, you have a group of people who split off from Alexander essentially after he died, some of his generals, and they split up Alexander's kingdom. And one group, they were called the Syrians or the Seleucids, they eventually took over the area of Israel. And they began to try and force them, meaning the Israelites, the Jews, to follow Greek practices, including abandoning the practices of the Jewish law, worshiping the Greek gods, all those kinds of things. And so eventually there was a revolt. The Jews had enough. Judas' father, he eventually, when asked to sacrifice to a pagan god, killed the soldier who was going to force him to sacrifice, as well as a Jew who was going to give in his sacrifice. And Mattathias, of course, being old, he wasn't in the position to actually lead this rebellion that he started, and so it passed on to his son. Now, we're talking about a group of Jews who at this point are just completely oppressed, have no weaponry, have no ability to accomplish anything in terms of fighting one of the strongest groups. I hate to say nations because they were more kind of a splinter empire, but they had no way at all to be able to defeat the armies of the Seleucids. And time and time again, battle after battle, somehow, under the leadership of Judas Maccabeus, they not only beat off the Syrians, they actually reconquered Jerusalem and restored the temple that had been profaned by the Seleucid king. Now, history continues on from that point, and things go haywire. His brothers make a mess of things after Judas dies and all this kind of stuff. But the reason I want to emphasize this is because it's very important to understand how the disciples are going to hear everything else in this chapter. The Jews are expecting the Messiah to be a better version of this guy. And if we don't have that picture in our minds, we're not going to get the impact of how Jesus answers their question. They're asking, when's the end of the age? When's the sign of your coming? When is all this happening? And they're expecting, essentially, when is another big conflict going to start? When is a rebellion going to begin? When are you going to lead us to victory? When are you going to establish an eternal Jewish kingdom with the temple at the center, with Jerusalem as the capital, with us never being able to be defeated again? That's the loaded question they're asking. And that's why it's so important for us to see what Jesus responds with. I'm going to read quickly through some parts of Matthew 24 as we continue here. And I just want us to get a summary of how he begins to answer starting in verse 4. See that no one leads you astray. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ. That means Messiah. It's just a different word for Messiah. And they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed. For this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations. And then the end will come. Now, already, for most people in the Christian world, imaginations are starting to run wild here. Okay, well, does this mean this about Jesus' second coming? Does this mean this about, what is this referring to? Is this referring to something that's about to happen? Is this referring to something that's going to happen way in the future? I want us, as we're going through this text, to be pulling together the big ideas, and let's see. Let's see what the text itself leads us to as to what Jesus is talking about. So far, what do we have? We have, there'll be false Christs. We have, there's going to be wars and a lot of political turmoil, a lot of kingdoms at each other's throats, nations at each other's throats. There's going to be some natural disasters. And there's also going to be increased persecution among Christians, or against Christians. Let's keep reading. Now we get to verse 15. So when you see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Okay, so something's coming. We have all these different things. People are going to be wavering their faith as well. The gospel's going to spread. We mentioned those. All these things are signs of something that's coming. But the disciples and us, if we're reading this for the first time, we don't quite get a sense of what it is yet. But this is building something. And then we get this statement, the abomination of desolation in verse 15. Now, how many of y'all just throw around phrases like that as you're walking around in an everyday conversation? Yes, the other day I walked into my office and there was an abomination of desolation there. And I had to get rid of it because I hate cockroaches, right? No, we don't use that kind of terminology usually. We just say things as they are and kind of simplify it down. But we have to, again, remember, the apostles, the disciples, they are asking this question with the prophets in mind. Daniel specifically. That's the imagery, that's the mindset, that's the background that they have as they are thinking about the Messiah and the end of time. They're thinking about those prophets, like Daniel, and they're thinking about how those prophets have been interpreted by people in their own day. And so Jesus, naturally, as he responds, is going to bring them to Daniel. But he's going to explain it a little better than the teachers of his day. So we have, talking about the abomination of desolation, a reference very directly to that exact phrase. You had a kind of allusion to it already when we looked at Daniel 9. You have another very clear one, even maybe clearer, in Daniel chapter 12. From the time that the regular burnt offering is taken away, any abomination that makes desolate is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Now, again, scratching the surface here. We could talk so much about numbers in Daniel. We could talk so much about just the overall setting of the statement. The point here, if we actually follow the context of Daniel, is there is being prophesied that something is going to come in the process of a lot of persecutions and things against God's people, and there's going to be this abomination that's going to be set up. In fact, real quickly, I told myself I wasn't going to go on tangents, but just real quickly, if you turn over to Daniel chapter 12, I just want us to kind of see the development here just a little bit. If I can flip there. There we go. Daniel chapter 12. You can ask Garrett, if you let me go on unfettered tangents, we'll be here all night. So we gotta keep that limited a little bit. But notice, Daniel chapter 12. So he says, "Go your way, Daniel," in verse 9. "For the words are shut up and sealed until the time of the end. Many shall purify themselves and make themselves white and refined, but the wicked shall act wickedly. Now the wicked shall understand, but those who are wise shall understand. And from the time, as we just read, of the regular burnt offering is taken away, and the abomination makes desolate is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he who waits and arrives at 1,335 days. But go your way till the end, and you shall rest and shall stand in your allotted place at the end of the days." Now, again, so much we could go into. he's referring back to a previous prophecy in Daniel, in chapter 12. He's referring back to one that he was given just a little bit ago that was referring to someone setting up an image of an idol, essentially, in the temple. That's what happened, part of what happened in that Syrian persecution. Daniel, of course, lived in the 600s. That persecution under the Syrians, the Seleucids, that happened and was being predicted in Daniel almost 400 years later. But something similar, Jesus is saying in Matthew, is going to happen with the sign of his coming, or with the when will these things be, or whatever we want to say. And so they're essentially being asked to think back on their own history, which is what they're already doing, and say, okay, what exactly is going to be something that could happen along the lines of an idol being set up in our temple? We'll get back to that in just a second. Now I want us to continue back in Matthew 24. So, keeping on in verse 16 and following, he said, when you see that abomination of desolation, he says, let the reader understand, because Matthew's expecting that we've read Daniel, the reader of Matthew has read Daniel. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas for the woman who is pregnant or nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight not be in the winter or on a Sabbath. For then there shall be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world, until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. That if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I've told you beforehand. So if they say to you, look, he's in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, look, he's in the inner rooms, do not believe it. And this is interesting. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures, or eagles, depending on your translation, will be gathered together. All right. So we've got another kind of summary here, right? So the signs we just talked about a few minutes ago, we have all these signs, the wars, the natural disasters, all these things. Here's how they're told to respond. He's saying, when you see this, this is what you need to do. The first thing is run. You don't need to be anywhere near Jerusalem. You don't need to be anywhere near people when you start seeing these things happen. You need to get out. That doesn't quite sound like the end of the world, but let's keep on going. You also need to expect the worst. Now, both in the minds of the Jews and the disciples, and if we're thinking about the second coming of God in general, or of Jesus in general, are we expecting it to be a good thing or a bad thing? Us.
Good.
We're expecting it to be good, right? We're looking forward to it. This is a positive thing that's happening. Now, if we want to talk from the perspective of those who reject God, well, sure, it's going to be a bad thing because there's going to be judgment. But from the perspective of people following God, this is something to look forward to. And yet, whatever this is that Jesus is describing, he says, you need to expect the worst. It's going to be bad. Hope, pray that it's not made worse by other circumstances. This doesn't sound like the end of the world, but it's definitely something major that's going to happen. Also, notice what he says. He says this is going to be temporary. He says if the days weren't shortened, no flesh would be saved. Some translations say no human being. I think the word actually is no flesh, and I think the implication is no one involved would be saved if the time wasn't limited, if the days weren't shortened. So, okay. And then we have, once again, kind of almost bookending this, right? We had this at the very beginning of what he started saying, and then again, this warning, don't fall for false saviors. Don't fall for people who say either they are the Messiah or that, oh, that guy actually was the Messiah, I'm the Messiah, and I can save you, I can make this situation right. Don't fall for any of that. Just go back to what he said at first. Run. Right? None of this fits so far with the end of all things. But let's keep reading and see where we're at. So he says, Well, actually, no. Let's pause there for just a second. Let's look at 27. For as lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Now, it's interesting. He just said he just said earlier something about the coming, and he's about to mention that again. But when they asked him, they first said, when will these things be? And then they said, when will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? It's almost as if he's contrasting his coming with whatever this is that he's talking about now, and saying, when that happens, everyone will know, and no one will be able to hide it. It won't be a secret. But right now, something else is happening, and people are saying, Son of Man, me, is coming back. But obviously that's not what's happening, because everyone will know when I come back. So, putting all those context clues together, so far, we really can't be talking about the end of time. Because everything that he said up to this point, number one, it is confined to very specific events that are said to be temporary, that are said to be leading to something bad, not good, and that are said to ultimately be, how do we put this? They're said to be something that's in contrast with his actual coming, because he says, whatever this is, know that it's not my coming, because you'll know, everyone will know. So what are we talking about here? Some of y'all probably already are picking up where this is going. Anybody know what Jesus is predicting here?
Destruction of the physical temple.
Destruction of the temple. Do what? Fall of Jerusalem, the fall of the temple. Andy's cheating a little bit because we talked about this in Revelation class. No, I appreciate that. So, artist rendition of Rome besieging Jerusalem, but even though I'm sure it's probably not super accurate, it gets the point across. We have, depending on when you date Matthew and so forth, at the very least, if we're dating from when Jesus actually said this, you have just a few decades after Jesus is on earth and dies and is resurrected and goes to heaven. Just a few decades later, you start having a lot of different events. In fact, at the risk of messing up my slideshow, I think I should be able to get back. Let's look at this again. Just a few decades after Jesus ascends, you have several things that begin to happen. I'm talking historically, and I could give you sources. Again, this is stuff that we don't have time to go into too much detail about. You have several people claiming they're actually the Messiah. That historically is documented as happening. You even have some of this mentioned in the book of Acts, if you remember. There are different people who try and start revolutions claiming that they're somebody. I think Gamaliel is one of the ones who says, these other things happened over here, and we just, they fizzled out on their own, so we should do the same thing with this Jesus cult, is how they would have thought about it. So you have that happening. What else do you have happening as we're getting into about the 60s AD? Well, you also have a lot of turmoil politically beginning to happen. You have a peace for a while in the Roman Empire, once Augustus kind of centralizes the government and so forth, but around the 60s, that begins to fall apart. Number one, Nero's crazy, right? He is just crazy on several levels as an emperor. And as his reign begins to come to an end, there's a lot of things that begin plunging Rome into chaos. In 60, you have the eruption of a volcano, which we're aware of with the city of Pompeii that gets buried in ash. Major natural disaster. You have the fire in Rome. It's unsure exactly how it started, but certainly a disaster for them. What else do you have happening? Well, Nero is the first one to actually begin a intense persecution of Christians, specifically in the city of Rome. But Rome itself hadn't really done much against the Christians until that point. So you have increased persecution happening. You have some false teaching already being introduced from several different levels. You have Paul's letters in particular addressing that, Paul writing some of his letters around the 60s. And in the midst of all this, you have a growing group of Jewish extremists called zealots. There were also, the exact terminology, there was specifically a group of zealots that were essentially assassins. They would sneak up behind Romans or behind Roman sympathizing Jews and just stab them in the middle of the street. We think about terrorist attacks now because there's bombs and guns. Well, they didn't have that. They have daggers, sneak up, stab, and then get away, and nobody saw what happened. That group, that faction within the Jewish area, Palestine, that becomes more and more influential until around 66 AD, with Rome having to fight against some of these natural disasters they've had, and then Nero going more and more crazy, the Jews finally decide, hey, we're going to revolt. And so they start a revolution. In the midst of that revolution, as it continues on, Nero dies. And in the wake of Nero's death, you have ultimately 4 different people in the space of a year competing to be the next emperor. So, of course, if you are a Roman subject wanting to be free, what better time than when the empire's in chaos and nobody even knows who the emperor is? It all just lines up really well, doesn't it? And so what's the response that Jesus is saying when you see these signs? Once you start seeing all this come together, you run. Why? Well, what happens? We can look back historically. Of course, they didn't, or they couldn't. That's why Jesus is giving them a warning. What happens historically? It's funny, even in Revelation, there's a reference to the beast that represents the Roman Empire, and it talks about this wound that was healed. I would argue this wound is this crisis where the emperors are all fighting for who actually has legitimacy. But ultimately, there's one man, Vespasian, who pulls it together. He sends his son to deal with the revolution in Jerusalem. And city by city, fortress by fortress, the Jews are decimated. Until finally, Titus marches on Jerusalem itself, and in one of the most brutal sieges in military history, even to this day, he ultimately takes Jerusalem, kills, by some estimations, I believe, 1 million people in the process, and destroys the temple in Jerusalem. A temple that ultimately would never be rebuilt in the same way. And even if you go today to the area, there's still not a temple there. At least not a temple of the likes of was ascribed in the Jewish scriptures. So that's what we see. We see Jesus answering their question with very end-of-the-world language, because what would this be for a Jew if their temple, if their city is destroyed? This is the end of the world in their minds. So he's using the same imagery that Daniel used. He's using the same imagery that they would use to describe something like this. But he's using it for a very specific purpose. And then he's going to begin shifting his focus. So we have all these warnings and this... where did my cursor go? Is it on there? It is. We have all this that he is giving as far as signs and as far as responses to those signs. There we go. So, now we get to what I think is probably the trickiest part. And we'll briefly read that in verses 29 to 31. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, I have it up here. The sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. That sounds pretty world-ending, doesn't it? All right, couple things. It's very, very clear, given everything he's just described, that he's talking about the destruction of the city of Jerusalem and the temple. If this is going to happen immediately after, now we get the benefit of hindsight, right? Did any of this literally happen within a few years of the destruction of Jerusalem, let's say? No. In fact, if you actually look at the context of this, let's just take the third phrase. The stars will fall from heaven. Now, they didn't have a super great working knowledge of astronomy back then. We have a little bit of a better working knowledge, right? If a star falls from heaven, quote unquote, to the earth, what happens? Do what?
Burns out.
You don't have an earth, right? I don't even know if there are stars that are smaller than the earth. I'm pretty sure most stars, if not all stars, are bigger. You don't have an earth if an event like that happens. And yet, if you follow this train of thought, everything that's being described as happening on the earth so far. But what you do have with this kind of imagery is, once again, this end of the world language being used to prove a point, not being intended to be taken literally. Notice the quotation from Joel in Acts 2 in Peter's presentation of the gospel. Joel said, "The sun shall be turned to darkness, and the moon to blood, before the day of the Lord comes, the great and magnificent day." Now, we have an advantage here because Peter very directly tells us what this passage is talking about. Anybody know what Peter says this passage is talking about?
The establishment of the church.
The establishment of the church. Essentially, Peter's saying what Joel predicted is happening right now. Well, on the day of Pentecost, when Peter proclaimed the gospel, did the sun actually go dark? No. What's the point? We actually see, again, we're doing Revelation on Sunday mornings, and so imagery is on my mind. We actually see the same imagery a lot in Revelation. The idea is, okay, if I got up in the morning, walked outside my front door, and I see the sun gone dark when it's supposed to be daylight, I see stars falling, I see everything shaking, well, what's that going to tell me? Well, number one, I should probably run, but what's that going to tell me, right? Everything, the foundation of everything is changing. It's being shaken up. That's the point. Everything is being shaken up. Everything you think is true is being changed. It's being turned on its head. Well, isn't that what's happening for the Jews? At least those who have rejected the Messiah at this point, and those who are expecting a different kind of Messiah. No. Jesus is saying, all this that I'm describing, it's going to be proof that everything you think is actually being turned on its head. We see that in this next statement. Again, can be very confusing if we don't look at the whole thing in context and remember how the disciples are asking their questions in the first place, where they're coming from. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. Then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, when they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. All right. This has to be the second coming of Christ, right? This has to be the end of the world. It's Christ in the clouds. Well, at first glance, certainly we would assume that, because that's what we're used to, and that's how we normally would use this imagery. We've got to go back to Daniel, because that's where they're thinking. We don't usually go to Daniel when we have this kind of stuff, but they would. Daniel chapter 7, one of the first visions Daniel has. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And we could say, okay, well, this is, maybe Daniel's still predicting the end of the world and the coming. No, because we got to go to the next verse too. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. His coming on the clouds in Daniel is not his second coming as we think of it. That represents him being exalted as the king of a new kingdom. What were the Jews expecting? They're expecting something like Judas Maccabeus. They're expecting an earthly kingdom. They're expecting Jerusalem as the capital of a world empire once again. Jesus is saying, no, when Jerusalem is finally destroyed, that will be proof for all nations, for everyone to see, I was right all along. It's my kingdom, the one that I came to establish, the one that's not made with hands, the one that's not of this world, that actually is going to endure forever, that actually has gained the victory. We've got to be really careful about using this imagery literally if we're not using the same mindset and background that they would have been using at the time. Notice verse 31. Again, for us, knee-jerk response based on our initial reading, because this imagery has been used in the New Testament in other ways, we've got to keep in mind how this is being used. He will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Again, doesn't this have to be the second coming? No, we're going to see conclusively why in just a second. This can't be the second coming, beyond all the other evidence we just looked at. But what's the whole context of this section of the chapter so far? Why is Jesus telling them this?
That their Jewish belief is going to be shaken and totally changed.
It's going to be shaken and totally changed, and therefore, what advantage does this give them? They don't have to die in Jerusalem with everyone who doesn't accept Christ. He's giving them a warning. He's giving them protection. He's gathering them and telling them, I'll keep you safe from what's coming if you'll just listen to me. Combine that with the fact that you also have the gospel continuing to go throughout the world, as he even predicts is going to happen leading up to this event. And then you also have the fact that if history serves us correctly and we have correct information, it would appear there wasn't a single Christian who got stuck in the city of Jerusalem during the siege of 70 AD. Why? Because they listened, right? They got a warning and they took it for what it was. So, then we have this concluding statement of this section of the chapter. And I know you're like, this section of the chapter, we got like 10 minutes left tonight. The next section is very quick, okay? It's by design also. He uses this example of a fig tree. You can tell when a fig tree is going to produce fruit. He says, all right, so when you see all these signs, notice, this isn't moving on to a new section yet, what we just talked about, the Son of Man and all that kind of stuff. This is still all part of the same discussion. He says, when you see all these things, you know that it is near at the very gates. This thing he's talking about, which by all evidence must be the destruction of Jerusalem, you know it's near. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. This generation will not pass away. He says, 40 years, give or take, before all these things did in fact occur. So even these things that very much seem, if we just read at face value without putting it all in context, they very much seem to be talking about the second coming. But if we keep it all in one group, as he did, he says this generation won't pass away until all these things take place. So far, we're actually in a very interesting position. This chapter, which in many cases is very, how shall I say this, very generously applied to the end times and to descriptions of what's going to happen at the end of the world, so far none of it is actually referring to that. It's referring to the destruction of Jerusalem. It's not about the end of our world. It's using end of the world language because it would have been the end of theirs in their minds. It's almost like God, Jesus, of course he's God, but it's almost like Jesus is killing their world for them ahead of time so that they can have their eyes open to what their world actually needs to be. But he's not done yet. And that's where we'll go as we conclude. But concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. Wait, what day and hour? Well, he was just talking about something. Is he talking about all that stuff he was just talking about? That's maybe an option just from a grammatical standpoint. He could be saying of that day and hour, meaning what we just said. There's two problems with that. Anybody know what the problems are? Okay, they asked a two-part question. That's part of it, yes. Why can't this be just continuing to talk about what he's predicting here?
Because he said,
Okay, that's good. Jesus knows when Jerusalem's going to be destroyed.
That he says that not even the angels know, and he doesn't know that. Jesus would know whenever Jerusalem's going to be destroyed. He's the one that's predicted it. So.
Okay, good. Not just he would know, he just told you, here's how you know when it will happen. Why on earth would he then turn around and say, no one actually knows when this thing I'm telling you is about to happen, but here's how you know it's going to happen. That doesn't work. Let's continue on with what he actually says then. Well, actually, let me just read it from here because I have a couple of excerpts here. Concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. As in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and given in marriage, until the day Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and one left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one left. All of a sudden, we've got a very different feel to the context of what Jesus is saying here. We're talking about a different kind of world-ending event. So let's see what we have. Number 1, 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and one left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one left. Typically, this is understood to be some form of what's known as the rapture. People get caught up to heaven or something, and then maybe some people get left to experience the first half of the chapter. I don't know. Depends on who you ask as to how they work out all that timeline. But let's keep that in our mind for a second. I want to keep on going in the reading for just a moment. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. Well, again, if he just gave them all the clues to find out, that doesn't make any sense. We've switched topics here. He's answering, as you said, the second half of the question. But know this, verse 43. If the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and not have let his house be broken into. If a guy calls you and says, hey, Tuesday night I'm going to pop into your house and rob you, is that okay? Yeah, that's okay, because now I know and I'll be there waiting for you, right? We don't know. We don't have any clue. We've got to be ready at any time because there's not going to be a warning. That's the whole point. Who then is that faithful and wise servant whom his master has set over his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant when his master finds him so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed, and begins to beat his fellow servants and eats and drinks with drunkards, the master of that servant will come on the day when he does not expect him, an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him with the hypocrites. In that place will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. All right. Once again, this image of the servant. If there's warning signs, I can steal from and abuse and beat up the other servants all day long until I see the warning sign, and then I can get my act together because now I know that the master's coming back. That can't be the context here. There's not a warning. There's not any signs. So what do we have, for example, with the 2 men in the field? One of these illustrations that he's using. Let's take it literally for a second. Jesus comes back. Somebody is caught up to heaven and somebody's left. Well, that doesn't sound like anything that we've seen so far. That certainly doesn't fit with the example of Noah. What could Jesus be trying to describe here?
That some will be...
Oh, sorry. I started thinking of voice.
That some will go to heaven and some won't. That maybe he's using the illustration of the earth will burn, what's left will be in a place of fire and brimstone.
Okay. Like I said, my hearing's a little off, so yes. We'll get to the earth, fire, brimstone, all that later on in this series. But for now, I just want to throw out there, with everything else that's been used in a form to try and get us to get a concept here, almost nothing in this whole chapter has been literal. The point is, if you're not ready, you get left out. Not literally you get left on earth or in a field or something. The point is, if you're ready, you get to be part of the kingdom and its full potential, if you will, at the second coming. If you don't, you won't. That's the idea. Let's remember, going back to the contrast he drew when he was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. When this other thing that you asked about comes, he foreshadows when he talks about the latter half of the chapter. When this other thing you were talking about comes, everyone will know. It'll be evident everywhere. No one will be able to escape it. So it's not like, some of the movies and popular literature, it's not like you blink and, oh man, people around me disappeared. I guess I wasn't good enough, right? Well, no, everyone will know what just happened. The point is, you got to be ready in order to participate in the way that you want to. Therefore, and this is the point, stay awake, as we just read. You do not know on what day your Lord is coming. Again, you must be ready. He's coming in an hour you don't expect. If there's signs, I'm going to expect it. We're talking about two different things here. And so then, again, he uses this imagery. A faithful and wise servant the master has set over his household. Because there won't be any warning, you just be doing what you need to be doing and serving your master until he comes back. Now, all that being said, how much in this chapter did Jesus actually tell his disciples, and by extension us, about the end of time? Very little, right? Basically, as we get to the end of this chapter and the end of our discussion for tonight, Jesus really doesn't give us much detail. I would argue in large part, he doesn't give us much detail because that wasn't really the purpose of his ministry. The purpose of his ministry was to turn the ideas that the Jews had of who the Messiah and the kingdom would be on their heads. Not to go into a whole lot of detail about the end of time and the afterlife and all those kind of things. As we're going to see in the next few weeks, Paul and Peter and John give us a few more details. Jesus just doesn't go there. That's outside of the scope of what he feels like is important for his ministry while he was here on earth. He does want us to know one thing, though. He wants us to know the end of time is going to come without warning. And so we need to be doing what we know because he has taught us. We need to be doing what we know we need to be doing because we don't know when he's going to come. There won't be warning. And so when he comes, we want to be ready. All that being said, we're just about out of time. Technically, since we started a couple minutes later, we have a couple minutes. Questions, comments, because I don't want us to leave scratching our heads any of these lessons that we're going to be doing.
The imagery of the east from the west reminds me of what was said about our sins being removed from us as far as the east from the west.
Yes.
Do you know why they use east and west?
Typically, I would say because, and this is partially speculation on my part, in their minds, the known world revolved around the Mediterranean Sea. And if you've ever seen the Mediterranean Sea, essentially you go west far enough and you get past the sea and there's just nothingness, because of course they didn't know America was out there. And then you go this way and eventually it's just, they kind of knew that India was there and that was about it. So in their minds you have kind of a very linear view of the world, and that would be my guess.
It was explained to me that if you think about a globe, you start walking north, at some point in time you're going to start heading south. But if you head east or west, no matter how many times you go around the world,
you're still going east or west.
Yes.
That's interesting. Yeah, they didn't have super great ideas, like I said, of astronomy, but that's an interesting thought. I hadn't thought of it that way. I like that. Any other thoughts? Any other comments? Any other questions? Rebuttals? Disagreements? Casting down the gauntlet for a duel. All right. I appreciate y'all so much. I'm really looking forward to continuing the series. Next week, I believe we're going to be looking at Paul, or maybe it's Peter. I'll have to look. But either way, I'm looking forward to continuing this and digging more into this topic. Thank y'all so much.
There's out here.